So let's get a little bit deeper into, I finished my pre-work inspection, I found an active nest. What do I need to know about that? So what we previously had talked about is if you are removing that tree, removing that branch, removing the shrub that the nest is in, that's 100% chance of impacting it, right? That's pretty clear cut. We're gonna try to leave it for a few weeks, let the young leave, and then we can go ahead and do our work at that point. If our work is really far away from that nest, we're gonna go ahead and do it. We think we're well outside the buffer, and we'll talk a little bit more about buffers today. And we're pretty unlikely to impact these nests, so we're going to go ahead and complete our work, again, pretty straightforward. What's less clear is if we want to work near a nest, our project is near a nest, and we're not sure, we won't be physically cutting the branch out of the tree, but us being up in the tree may be enough to disturb that nest enough that the likelihood of success decreases, right? Some chance that that nest gets abandoned or something else happening. So this is difficult to predict, and what I've said is what's best to do is bring in a wildlife biologist. But we're gonna talk a little bit more about that today to give you a little bit more context around that and help you make some decisions, but also encourage you to bring in wildlife biologists when you're finding yourself in these sorts of situations. So the reason why we focus on nests, I think, are two main reasons. For most of a bird's life, most of all wildlife life, they're pretty good at avoiding us, right? Could you imagine trying to catch a hummingbird out in the wild while it's flying around? It would be impossible. But when they have this hummingbird nest on the right here, it is stuck in one location. And so us being able to cut that branch and harm wildlife greatly increases when they can't move, when they're confined to this one location. And also, they are just so fragile. Like, look at that little hummingbird bill sticking out of the nest, or that little fluffy robin down in the bottom left. They're so delicate, and it would just be so easy to harm them at this stage, rather than you see that big adult robin. It's quite strong, quite able to sort of tolerate a little bit of impact. And so let's talk about our tree care activities. So how would these wildlife perceive our tree care activities that we're doing here? So I'm gonna work on unsharing my screen and sending it over to Courtney because she's got the next slide, but I'm gonna just keep talking about this one. Just memorize everything on the screen right here. So I think the main things that we do to impact wildlife are we come into their territory, right? They're accustomed to building nests in trees or wherever else, and that they don't have any, that we're not up there, right? We're not coming into those spaces. But when we have a crane or a boom truck or a climber going into those spaces, just physically being in their space stresses them out and potentially impacts their nest. And the reason that we're up in these trees is normally to remove vegetation. So when we're looking at this eucalyptus in the upper right, we could imagine that maybe there was a nest in the eucalyptus on the right, and they removed the top of it, they topped it and removed all this vegetation, but they didn't actually touch the nest. But this is no longer a good nesting site for this tree. This tree is no longer a good nesting site for this nest. And so we've really altered the ability of them to be able to have a successful nest on this site. So we really don't want to be removing vegetation in the tree that these are nesting in. Finally, the noise and sort of vibrations that we create, right? We're working with noisy chainsaws and noisy chippers and things like that. So I'm mostly focused on the noise aspect because that's the one that affects sort of furthest away. And when we start imagining these buffers of being like 100 feet, right, we're really talking about this noise and disturbance and activity, and that's the sort of parts that we're most concerned about. So I'll turn it over to Courtney at this point. Any thoughts on tree care activities that I didn't mention, Courtney, before you dive into other things?
Yeah, so I was just going to mention on the tree on the right, I've had questions like that from arborists before where they say, well, we didn't touch the nest. It's still in the tree, but we just kind of cut around it and, basically you took the protection away from it. So you guys have to think of it in that way too, is that the birds pick the nest location partially so that they can, not be seen by other birds and not be predated. And so if you essentially take away all the cover, but you just don't touch the nest, it doesn't make it any easier for them to survive or thrive with that nest, and it could potentially fail. So I just wanted to add that. I mean, you touched on it, but I just wanted to add some more thoughts. All right, so impacts to birds. These are 2 photos from projects that I've been on before, just showing different activity levels. So there are several ways that birds can be impacted. One is noise, which is what Ryan was talking about. One is activity. There's different levels of activity, and they can provide or they can cause different disturbances to birds. Hand tools, which is this photo down here on the bottom, that was some vegetation removal crews that were strictly using hand tools. And then versus mechanical. So then you can have something like an excavator. And these both obvious, I mean, I think it's obvious, but they both provide different disturbances to birds and nests. And same with walking versus driving. So a lot of the time, you know, we may not think about it, but if you're standing there watching a bird intently, or even just walking by, walking slowly, or even just a group of people talking near a nest, that can be a different disturbance versus driving by a nest where maybe there were cars there, you know, it's off of a main street and there are cars driving by all day, so they're used to cars. So different, you know, levels of disturbance. And then same with vibrations. Vibrations are kind of along the same lines of, I think of it along the same lines as noise. And birds can and will abandon a nest from vibrations and noise. I've seen that before. And then, and as an aside, bats can also be sensitive to vibrations and noise as well. And then a little less obvious is that it's dependent on each pair, and it actually kind of goes all the way down to each bird. So some birds are really sensitive to humans and you know, them being around, and then some birds are not sensitive at all. So sometimes, you know, I've seen hummingbirds have nests on somebody's front porch, and so then you would say that that bird is not is okay with a, you know, a high level of disturbance. The person is using their front door every day to go in and out, and they're still having a successful nest. But then, you know, I've seen something along the lines of a red-tailed hawk where if you come within 200 feet of it, it flushes from the nest and then it leaves while it's incubating. So it's different for each bird, and it's different for each pair what level of disturbance they're used to, and that's where a biologist comes in, and they can help you determine, you know, buffer size and their sensitivity to the work that you're going to conduct. So these are just some photos of nests failing, and maybe some examples. So this, so you know, you start out with a nest. You know, you have your bird sitting on it, it's incubating. There's several things that can happen. So I'll start with the photo on the left, which looks like it was a bush tit, maybe a bush tit nest at one point, and they abandoned that nest and it failed. So at some point they may have been building it, or they may have even gotten to the point where they laid eggs and then they abandoned it and it ended up looking like that. So nest abandonment is a way that a nest can fail. Having chicks, so mothers can abandon, well, so they can abandon their chicks. And then another issue that we face is if there's too much disturbance, those chicks that are maybe not ready to fly quite yet prematurely leave the nest, and then they end up snake food, which is the photo on the right. So predation of the nest from either us showing the predator where the nest is, or from chicks falling out of the nest and that predation occurring there. Those are both things that can happen as a result of us, you know, of humans conducting tree work, maybe irresponsibly, or not having proper buffers or knowing where the nests are. So we all want to avoid any nests failing. I think. Okay, so another one that's kind of along the same lines. It's not necessarily failing unless unless the fledgling doesn't make it. And I can talk about several examples, but is early fledging. So basically what can happen is you have chicks and they aren't necessarily ready to fly yet, and you have a nest, it depends on the bird, but say you have a corvid like this, and the nest is 50 plus feet high in a tree. They're not quite ready to leave yet, and they end up on the ground because of some human disturbance created by tree care. So then they end up on the ground, and then what meets them when they're on the ground? So they have number one is dogs. If you're in an urban area, really almost anywhere it feels like these days, there's a dog, and people can have their dogs off leash, and dogs can and will go after birds on the ground. And so if you're a fledgling and you can't fly yet, and you're just kind of hopping around and you're flailing around, you will get predated very easily. And then beyond that, dogs, you can think of coyotes definitely would predate them. Anything kind of bigger than that, it depends on where you are, bobcats, mountain lions, etc. You can expand on that. And then other than that, it's humans. They could cars. That sometimes the adults will feed fledglings from the ground, but only actually they will feed their fledglings from the ground. But if for some reason they can't find them, or there's humans down there and it's more dangerous for the adult to feed their chick, I've seen them, not feed them. So this is also something that we want to avoid during our tree cares, is early fledging, premature fledging. Okay, so now we're going to talk about minimizing impacts. Since there seems to be a lot of people interested in killdeer, there's a killdeer nest. I feel like we had a question last week on killdeer, and I think I saw one this week on killdeer too. So we're going to reduce impacts to a nest. So how do we do that? So number one, I think, is buffers, right? So this is something that we're going to talk about here in a minute, setting up buffers and things like that. But you want to set up the appropriate buffer for the bird and the surrounding environmental factors. So when you take into consideration the bird, you want to take into consideration kind of its size and what agency buffers are generally produced, for that bird. Small birds, smaller buffers; bigger birds, bigger buffers in general. And then beyond that, you want to take into account its sensitivity and maybe pre-existing environmental factors. So if there was construction around the nest while they were nest building, and they still built the nest while there was construction, then that is an environmental factor that you need to take into account. Versus like an open space where there's been nobody around for days and days and days, and they built the nest, and holy crap, there's a human. So there's different environmental factors that you guys need to take into account when setting up these buffers. And then tools to be used. We talked about this. There's a difference in mechanical versus hand tools. In general, hand tools can be less invasive. They provide, or they definitely have less noise and less vibration. And so they can be, like I said, less disturbing to a bird than mechanical means. But I know that that's not always possible to use those. So definitely consider the tools that you're going to use. And then access to a work area. Sometimes people don't think about this, but I touched on it in the previous slide. So walking versus driving, those provide different disturbances for birds. And so not only do you have to think about the buffer that you're going to provide for the bird, but then you just while thinking about it, it's access to the work area. So not only working versus driving, but if you're going to, say you have to drive through an area and, you're brushing up against a lot of bushes, maybe you want to check those for nesting birds so that you don't, hit a nest while you're driving along the access route in order to get to the trees that you need to get to. Or, say you're gonna toss all of your cut trees down into a certain area that ends up being, having a lot of bushes or something like that. There could be a nest in those bushes. So just things to think about, because our disturbance is not just on the one tree that we're going to cut. It could be, You know, there's multiple things to think about while you're doing that work. And then lastly, obviously, you can involve a biologist. So they can help you determine if the nest is active versus inactive. They can help you determine buffers. Most of the time, I've seen on a lot of projects, you know, agencies, they will go with like a standard buffer. And then if a biologist gets involved, depending on the bird and the situation, buffers may be reduced or they may get bigger. It just depends on the situation. But generally agencies I have found feel better when there's a biologist on site. They feel a little bit more reassurance, and they just, sometimes, like I said, they can have a little leniency on the buffers if there's a good argument for that. And generally a biologist can take into account all those different factors. And then they can, of course, monitor during your work. So if there is a nest, you know, and the agency says, okay, you know, you guys can cut, but you have to have a biologist. And if the bird flushes or leaves their nest and the biologist sees that, and then you have to stop your work, or so, you know, something along those lines. I've monitored during work during, you know, something like that where, you know, okay, so we have a nest, we set up the buffer, and then they want to work, you know, just outside of that buffer. And so the agency says, all right, you know, monitor their work. And if the bird flushes, then, you know, you guys obviously have to stop. But at least you have the biologist on site to know when they're getting agitated and when it's too much for the bird. Okay, so here is a diagram of a buffer. Let's see. Ryan, I think we were just going to talk about, I'm sorry, jump in just for a quick sec. We were just going to talk about, like, so you have the nest in the tree, as in the diagram, and just showing how the buffer, you know, can encompass, you know, like a whole radius around the nest.
Yeah, so buffers are really three-dimensional space, and that we as in the tree care industry don't think much about this upper end, but sometimes they talk about that for like helicopters and, you know, all sorts of drones and different things. And so in most situations, we're going to deal with it in 2 dimensions, which is what it looks like on the left, is sort of this cylinder, you know, measured out on a map in 2 dimensions. But it's worth noting that if you have a really sensitive species that only needs a 50-foot buffer, that this sort of cylinder buffer, where in a very tall tree, you may be able to go ahead and do work all sorts of areas down at the ground below it may be appropriate. So I think that that's what we're trying to emphasize here, of just sort of starting to think about this space. And in a lot of ways, I think it's pretty similar to tree protection zones that we use in tree preservation work. A lot of my work is sort of construction related like that. Just trying to establish that. So Courtney, tell me a little bit about these buffers and what you can do inside and outside of them. And, you know, because most of these places are going to be places where there are, you know, parks and people working and doing things. What can you tell us about that?
It varies highly. So I have had very strict buffers where you cannot go inside that buffer, you can't walk inside of it, you can't drive inside of it, you can't work inside of it. And that was a really strict site, and that area was completely off limits until the bird had left. And then I've worked on sites where, you know, we were able to work within a red-tailed hawk buffer because the red-tailed hawk was farther along in the nesting process, and the chicks were grown and they were not showing any disturbance to our work. Like, you know, they were working and they were not showing any signs of distress. And so we actually did tree care, you know, around and within a red-tailed hawk buffer. But the red-tailed hawk was up on a power tower, you know, maybe 200 feet. I don't know. It's just incredibly high. So it's really different for each site. I'm sorry, that was kind of a.
Well, I think what I've heard from some wildlife biologists, and looks like Kara's gonna get some input here, I love that, is that, you know, it's sort of loosely around the amount of activity that was happening when it chose the site, right? So if it's a public park with lots of people around, it chooses that site, it's accepted that is a level of activity that it's comfortable with. But if we come and do construction in that park, that was not sort of a level of activity that included in the baseline. Is that how you two approach these questions, or do you think about it differently than that?
Cara, do you want to go first?
No, I agree. It definitely matters what kind of activities were already going on when a bird decided to nest. Like the example you gave earlier of the hummingbird on somebody's front porch. That bird obviously chose that spot despite the fact that there was activity going on all the time and was comfortable with it. So that definitely factors in.
Definitely. So,
and I actually, sorry, go ahead, Courtney.
No, oh, I was just going to say the red-tailed hawk example was in a park, but I didn't know if there was previous construction and tree work activities, but that red-tail had probably nested there years prior, so it might have seen tree care in prior years. So the pair could have, now that you're mentioning it, the pair could have been used to that. So yeah.
And I actually jumped on because this seemed like a good conversation to give one of the questions that was sent in from Tammy Church. She says, I'm interested in buffers for bald eagles. In addition, what kind of maintenance activities are restricted in them regardless of breeding season? For instance, pest management for animals that might be prey for the eagles. Also, buffers for killdeer, are there different buffers for work versus things like driving slowly through?
So Courtney, maybe I'll take over the screen again and go to the next slide while you sort of jump into this.
Yes. Did I give you my screen? Okay.
I think I've got it now. Mine's up now, right?
Yes. Did you want to talk, Ryan, or do you want me to talk?
Sure. I'll just start off by saying that bald eagles and eagles in general have higher levels of protection and larger buffers that we're typically recommending for it. Bald eagles are quite a bit smaller than golden eagles in terms of the buffer recommendations, and they seem to be pretty tolerant of a lot of impacts. Like in the Northwest, they're often nesting in pretty urban areas, whereas I don't think that's true for bald eagles. Other thoughts on that, Courtney?
No. And I was going to bring it up later, which I will during the visual, is just that sometimes land formations can, that are, say, in the middle of a buffer, like a big raptor buffer or a big eagle buffer, can sometimes cause the buffer to be shorter or smaller than it is. So I've also seen that where the agencies are okay. And I could, like I said, I could bring it up during the visual, but like I've seen agencies where, say a bald or a golden eagle, is a certain distance away, but then there's a land formation that blocks the raptor's view from the work that you are doing, and it doesn't show any disturbance, that can sometimes cause the buffer to be smaller. So
great. Yeah, so in general, in terms of trying to figure out what the buffer might be for your different species, in the best management practices, this is one of the appendices that Cara put together and put a lot of great effort into. And so it has 660 feet listed for a bald eagle buffer. And so this is what we recommend unless you involve a wildlife biologist who knows more about the situation. And that, Cara, is killdeer fit into wader category? Would you say that 200 feet in a low habitat value area and 300 feet in a high habitat value area would be a good starting point, or what would you think for a killdeer?
I'm not sure. I wouldn't put them in with the waders. I don't know if we include them on the next page of the table or not. 200 feet's probably more than you'd necessarily need for a killdeer, but yeah, I think of them as a little bit more tolerant. But also the part of that question about the difference between doing work within a buffer versus driving through a buffer. That's something that we deal with a lot on our projects, and typically driving through a buffer is okay for most species as long as you're not stopping within the buffer. So just passing through is usually okay in a car, but you aren't supposed to stop and idle within that buffer. I'm going to throw in one more bird-specific buffer question while we're on it. Tammy Church also asked for great horned owls when it is considered fledged. I've heard that they reach the branching stage. So like when they're walking out onto branches and hanging out, where they are strong enough to explore the nest tree, but are not really strong flyers. And so this kind of falls into what Courtney was talking about earlier with the fledglings that jump too soon. I would say when a great horned owl is still in that stage, they are susceptible to that same problem of jumping and trying to fly when they're scared and aren't ready, and end up on the ground and potential prey for dogs and coyotes and other creatures.
I agree. Out of all the owl nests that we have in our Griffith Park Raptor survey, a lot of them prematurely fledged and ended up on the ground, and they are very susceptible. I mean, they're not as mobile for some reason. Like we've had fledgling Cooper's hawks end up on the ground, and they are a lot more mobile and can find a bush or something to go to. But for some reason, the owls kind of are a little helpless. So yeah, and when they're in that branching stage, they're still susceptible to premature fledging and ending up on the ground and potentially not making it.
All right, thanks for jumping in, Cara. We'll go a little bit further here and then do another check-in with you about time and questions and what we want to do. So anyways, start using this buffer table and experimenting with it and seeing what sort of needs to be improved. We're working on improvements to it right now as we expand to the other states as to what exactly we want to do. And something Cara and I will circle back on is killdeer, that they don't seem to fit perfectly into one of these categories. Maybe we need more categories or to do some other clarifying. So I wanted to give a demonstration of some buffers based on one of my projects. This was not a nesting project. This is just, I look at trees all day. And so this is a tree inventory that I had in the Bay Area. And all of these white dots are trees. So let's say that we have a project planned where we're going to, do tree care work on all of these trees. And we find a finch nest in the corner here. So we've set up our buffer, and this is the area that we think we're not going to do any tree care activities, but we could go ahead and work outside of these areas. We can go ahead and prune the vast majority of our trees on the site. And that would be pretty different than if we find a Cooper's hawk nest in the middle of the site. And that because the Cooper's hawk buffer requirements are so much larger, that would really mean that we couldn't be working on this site at all until the young have left the nest. So being able to identify the group of bird that you're working with and what that buffer might be could change the nature of how this impacts your project a lot, and might be a good reason to involve a biologist early if you're not very comfortable in identifying birds. And I would suspect that most people on this call would struggle to identify a bird to species, but might be able to differentiate between a raptor and a non-raptor. That might be a good level of trying to get to for all of us to be able to do this sort of work. And so wildlife biologists will be able to help us set those buffers, figure out the species, figure out what we do to actually work inside of those areas. And then we just wanted to show a little bit of a real world example. So Courtney, what can you tell us about Griffith Park?
Oh yeah, so we have a 4-year-long raptor monitoring program in collaboration with the Friends of Griffith Park. And this was just a map that we provided to the Los Angeles Department of Parks and Rec and the LA Film Office. And these are all the raptor nests within Griffith Park and the surrounding area. And we have the study area goes into the San Fernando Valley, Glendale, Burbank, Silver Lake, and like Westwood area. So it's, and this is just to show the amount of raptor nests that you could have in a given space. And for example, some of them look like there are 2 circles like overlaid on top of each other. Raptors reuse the same nest from year to year, but sometimes depending on the raptor, they can have 2 nests and not just 1. So anyway, so that would be a pair. And so this is just showing the buffer, and this like I said, was provided to management so that they know where the nests are during their, off-season, management practices, and just that those are the buffers that they get, and just to be more aware of where they are. And it's just to show how many raptors could just be in this small little park in Los Angeles. So
I'm so bummed out to see this, Courtney, because we had planned our in-person meetings in Griffith Park, and we were going to be able to go and wander around in this beautiful space rather than me being stuck here in this room.
I saw that. I was pretty bummed too, because I could have it was at Crystal Springs, and I was like, oh man, there were so many good raptor nests right there. Oh.
How is this being used, Courtney? So in our BMPs, we list for birds of prey, a 300-foot buffer for low habitat value areas and a 500-foot buffer for high habitat value areas. Did you consider doing, I see that it's listed as 500 feet. Did you consider different buffers, and how were they actually using this information?
Yeah, so the Film LA office, it kind of sparked from there being a photo shoot or a film shoot during the nesting season right underneath a Cooper's Hawk nest, and that Cooper's Hawk actually ended up not using that nest after the filming occurred. And so it, because the Film LA office didn't hire a qualified biologist, they just hired, I'll just say a non-qualified biologist that didn't find the Cooper's Hawk nest. And then the filming happened, and then the Cooper's Hawk abandoned that nest. So this kind of came out of a little sad times. But so this is just used for, because there's so much filming in Griffith Park. It's a very popular film spot, but it's also a high habitat value in general. So I know that on the outer edges, it's parkland, and so some people might consider that not high habitat value, but for the most part, Griffith Park is considered high habitat value and somewhat intact habitat. And so that's why we gave it the 500-foot buffer. And they use this for, like I said, filming and for tree care and like public safety management activities. Rec and Parks, they do a lot of management for Griffith Park and actually all the parks that they manage. And so it's just for them to be more aware of where these nests are and to not cut them out or, unintentionally harm them. Cool.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I love seeing these maps and data. That those are one of the fun things about these types of projects. I wanted to point out for anyone who joined on Thursday or didn't join, I suppose, the White Tern in Hawaii now has best management practices about how to do tree care and protect it. And so they've taken a pretty similar approach where they have established buffers and sort of nesting survey protocols. And the buffers that they've recommended are only 10 feet. And so when you are working with a single species in an area where you only really see that species and it's very easy to identify it, you can really research these species and experiment with it and see what is working. And that they found that this species is so tolerant of human activities that they could get that buffer down to 10 feet. So I just want to point out that this is like way different than almost all of our species in California. So don't think that a 10-foot buffer is good enough. We want those to be quite a bit larger than that, but that we have a pretty similar approach in Hawaii going on for anyone who wants to check that out. And that they have this sort of buddy system that they're recommending where one person is up in the tree working and the other person is watching the bird. And if the bird gets off the nest, then they signal to their partner like, hey, you're too close, back up, and maybe we'll try again later. Maybe we'll leave it till after the young have fledged and things like that. And that this is really how we can use wildlife biologists because they'd have to know about so many species, not just one bird species. They'll be able to give us some insight of like, oh, hey, this bird is stressed out. We need to do something different here. Okay, let's talk a little bit about wildlife emergencies. I have a feeling we'll circle back to buffers in our question and answer period. But the wildlife best management practices talk about two different kinds of emergencies. The first is a health and human safety emergency. So I'd like to acknowledge the incredible work and difficult work that so many of you are doing in terms of managing tree risk through urban forests. And that's hard. It's a big enough challenge on its own. And when you start adding nesting wildlife to that, it starts getting really complicated. And so while we want to be out there protecting nesting wildlife, we also don't want anyone to die. And we want to really be focused on trying to find that right balance between the two. So in a health and human safety emergency, what we recommend is that we have a track qualified arborist perform a level 2 basic risk assessment, right? So the full risk assessment so that we have the entire form filled out back and front, hopefully, and have arrived at a well-defined risk rating of either low, moderate, high, or extreme. Now, every situation is going to be a little different, but I have an overly simplified decision model here of how I would start approaching these situations. If we have a tree that someone has flagged or identified as a potentially hazardous tree and has asked me to go out and assess it and make a recommendation, if it is a low risk tree, I'm going to recommend not removing it. We may remove it because it's dying. We may remove it because it's invasive. I'm not going to recommend a low risk tree for removal for risk related reasons. We'll still manage it, things like that, right? A moderate risk tree, we maybe are going to remove depending on the situation, maybe going to prune depending on the situation. We're definitely going to be thinking about mitigating that risk. But we're going to do that in the non-breeding season. This is not an emergency. This does not need to happen right now if it's moderate risk for the most part. There may be situations, but that's going to be my approach for moderate risk. High risk is what I'm really focused on, what I think of as where we need to make some hard decisions. That's when we call a wildlife biologist. I call Courtney, she comes to the site with me, we work it out together. We problem solve, we try to figure something out, and we make a decision, and maybe she's contacting the agencies to help me get the permits I need and other agreements in place, and we're gonna act and do something probably this week, right? Something pretty quick. In an extreme risk situation, we're talking imminent, we're talking not severe, severe consequences. We're talking about high likelihood of impact all the way across the board. I'm going to be acting right now, right? I'm going to call my wildlife biologist. I'm going to ask them to meet me on site. I'm going to arrive and take some photos and documents and things. Then I'm going to take the nest out of the tree and bring it to a rehab center, and I'm going to mitigate the risk, right? So I think that we could be really specific about our language when we're in a health and human safety emergency of high and extreme risk. We are in an emergency, and that we can act appropriately when it's absolutely necessary. We don't want anyone to die because of we didn't know what to do. We didn't know how to act when we had nesting wildlife in there. I suspect that CDFW has a high risk tolerance, if to use tree risk assessment terminology. So if it's moderate or low, they're going to expect us to not mitigate that risk. If it's higher extreme, that's when we're starting to look at mitigating that. So that's what I think I expect to see, but I'm interested in seeing what other people's experiences are with this and how we can continue this conversation moving forward. So for example, this was a high risk tree. This was an 11 on the old 12-point system, where we have two 30-inch Monterey pine stems cracked all the way down the middle, right? They met at 12 feet, and I could see the crack at the base of the tree. I could see light through the crack at the base of the tree. And so we called our client, had them come out and work on removal. As they're climbing the tree, they noticed that a raptor that red-tailed hawks are building a nest in one of these stems. They're a big entity and had their in-house wildlife biologist come out and work it out with them. They removed one of the stems, partway down, left the rest, and anyways, when you have a wildlife biologist involved, you can start making these sorts of good decisions and work our way through it. They're good problem solvers generally. They show up with solutions. I think that we can always plan on mitigating the risk in other ways. So if this tree was deemed, extreme risk or a high risk and had an active nest in it, we're not going to remove this tree. We're going to move these picnic tables. We're going to fence off this area. We're going to think about other solutions before we take that active nest out of the tree. So I'd like to differentiate between that and a wildlife emergency. This is when we have injured or abandoned wildlife and need to act and do something about it. So a good example of this is when we have a tree and it's scheduled for removal and we have an active nest in it. So we just pull that nest out, bring it to the rehab center and remove the tree, right? So everyone yelling no, that is not what a wildlife emergency is. In this situation, we're going to leave this nest and we're going to do our tree work later after the young have left the nest. A wildlife emergency looks more like this. We had a tree fail. There are injured wildlife on the ground. We did our best to identify all the nests we could. We missed one and it ended up on the ground. So these are wildlife emergencies. And so the first thing that you want to do is have some contact information for your wildlife rehabilitation center. So know who your local players are. We have a website here with the list from all of California. And you'll notice that they have different specializations. So know what species they take in and what they don't, and have their contact information so that when something happens in the field, you have a partner that you can call and try to work it out with them. One of my friends, Megan Jankowski, has a lot of experience with wildlife rehabilitation. She did some presentations with me before, so I've stolen a little bit from her of some times that are sort of obvious that you're going to need to use a wildlife rehabilitation center. If there is blood or bones sticking out, it is clearly injured. That's a good time to contact a wildlife rehabilitation center and plan on bringing the bird or other wildlife in. If it was caught by a cat, they often have these deep sort of invisible injuries from the cat claws, and that's a good time to plan on bringing it into a rehab center. If it is an adult that can't fly or a adult that can fly but keeps running into things, a lot of birds that came into the rehabilitation center that I worked at had neurological disorders where they couldn't avoid things, and that they were able to recover from that, but that was why they came in. And if it's too young to sort of take care of itself, like this bird in the photo here, clearly not take care of itself, and you can't get it back in the nest. So a lot of people think that you can't put birds back in a nest because the scent is going to scare away the parents or something like that. That's not true. I would call a rehab center before I picked up a bird and put it into a nest and ask them for a little bit of advice. But I think that that's the best solution, and that the rehab center is pretty likely to tell you everything's fine, don't bring it in. They actually, the one that I worked at, complained a lot when people brought in birds that were totally healthy and was like, okay, cool, thanks for bringing this in. Can you go put it back where you found this? Because it did much better out there. A lot of these rehab centers have these sort of flow charts. So here's two from Marin in the Bay Area, where it sort of gives you some guidance about when to bring it in and when not to bring it in. And there's many of these floating around the internet. I think people really like this one because it's got a dinosaur on it as sort of this fun joke that you run into in the middle. And Megan just wanted to point out that please do not make a nest from dried grass or a basket and attach it to the tree with wire. If you have been trained in how to do this and have experience with it, great. If you have never done this before, please do something else. Please do not take that route. But largely they're gonna tell you either leave it where it is or put it in the nest or come bring it to us. They generally will not come and pick them up. So if they do that, put it in a box or a bag, something that's pretty secure and will keep them in there. If they, find their strength and fly out all over your car, that's not a good situation. Don't give them any water, don't give them any food unless the rehabbers tell you specifically what to do. And bring the nest if it's there, because the little tiny birds and eggs can be really difficult to identify. So if you have that, bring it in. But keep it quiet. Don't play the music in your car loud while you're driving to the rehab center. Turn on the air conditioner if it's really hot outside, things like that. And I'll just point out that wildlife rehab centers are basically run by volunteers, and they they're always looking for volunteers. And arborists have particular skill sets and resources that they find really valuable. They're often looking for people to go and return birds up into trees, up into their nests, and to do a variety of things that involve climbing or cranes or bucket trucks that we may have access to. They're often looking for perches, branches, and different types of foliage that we can bring and drop off into their rehab centers. So it's a really good opportunity for us to partner with someone and have a really positive effect in the community.
All right, I think this one is particularly interesting. And it's from Daniel Piskowski. I hope I said that right. But he asks, are vernal pools, which are considered a distinctive type of wetland, considered riparian habitat when they are nowhere close to a stream or body of water. In Sacramento, you find them in vacant fields during the winter rains, and migrating waterfowl will use them. However, by late spring, they are dried up and you don't even know they were there.
I'll defer to the wildlife biologist first. I have a couple thoughts, but Courtney, do you have any thoughts on vernal pools?
Not too many. I mean, so I do know that, yeah, at times you'll know that they're there, and then, you know, that they aren't there. But I don't know. I don't have too many comments on it. I don't do a lot of vernal pool work, so I don't want to speak out of without too much knowledge on that.
Sure, let me try to just attack this pretty generally. Vernal pools probably are not very great habitat for nesting birds, and that we've really been focused on nesting birds here. They have lots of rare flowers and plants. They have lots of rare, brachiopods, small invertebrates. They have lots of rare things, super high habitat value, not at all related to anything we talked about today.
All right, next question from Daniel. I've found a lot of squirrels, a few raccoons and possums in the cavities of our 100-year-old English elms, which were previously topped back in the 1940s. How should we treat these critters?
Good question. Courtney, how often do you deal with nesting mammals?
Not too often. In trees? Not too often.
Okay, so let me tell you a few things that I think I know about mammals. We have struggled in this project to find mammal experts who can give us a lot of help in figuring out some of these practices. But here's a quick stab at it. So my understanding is that there are 4 species of tree squirrels in California, more ground squirrels, but ones that live in trees. And they primarily build these drays, these sort of 3-dimensional leaf structures like this. And that there are 2 native and 2 non-native species. The main species that we see in our urban forests are non-native. They are protected by sort of animal cruelty laws, but and then the native ones are protected a little bit more, but none of them as much as the Migratory Bird Treaty Act or anything like that. We have a variety of raccoons and other mammals that live in these sort of natural cavities, like the barn owls are living in here, would be sort of the way that I've most seen them anyways, and certainly could be impacted by tree care. And that for all of these, I would say that, do I want to include bats in that? I'll include bats in this too. We have lots of bats in California. I think there are 15 species in the San Francisco Bay Area. And they live in a variety of different places. They could live in caves. They can live sort of hang from the branches in trees, sort of look like a leaf. And a really popular place for them to roost is to sort of, as a tree dies and the bark peels away as there's sort of that differential drawing, it creates this bark flange, and they often live inside there. So my coworker 2 days ago just texted me that they were using a resistograph, a resistance drilling, into this area and disturbed bats in this bark flange area. Okay, so a lot of these all of these species have some sort of protection. A lot of them have sort of more protection based on different things, but that we don't seem to have very good methods for finding them in our sort of surveys as we do in like bats in particular are hard to find. So we're going to be observant of them. We're going to try not to impact them. And we're generally not going to offer them very large buffers or maybe buffers at all. So that we can, if we find a squirrel nest with young in it, we suggest leaving that nest, but not, staying 100 feet away or anything like that, just leaving that nest there. And that's as best as we can do at the moment. Anyone want to say that that's all wrong or have more thoughts on that?
I was just going to comment just on bats, just that there aren't as many regulations in terms of bats. So they're also, and like you said, it's a lot harder to survey for them. So I've done many bat surveys, and it usually involves nighttime surveys, and you have to do an emergence survey. And you also have to have certain technology with you that you can be able to tell what kind of bat it is if you're not going to miss net or catch them. So it does take like somebody with that that device, and then you have to do like an emergence survey, and the regulations just aren't quite up to par with birds for some reason. I mean, we do have protected bats in California, but they're just not quite as strict as birds yet.
And something I've seen in other places of the country, so Hawaii and Iowa and Wisconsin, somewhere else in the Midwest, have really strict policies around bats because they have endangered species of bats in their area, nesting in the urban forest, and really, really like, you know, broad regulations. So in Hawaii, for 3 months of the year, you're not supposed to remove a tree anywhere. Right, that's a really strong policy, and Iowa has something pretty similar to that. And as bats all over the world are declining really drastically in numbers, and I suspect that we're going to have some listed bats pretty soon and some regulations like this pretty soon, and have to start figuring out how to navigate it.
Ready for the next question?
Yeah.
If you're trying to restore native habitat, is it appropriate to remove eucalyptus even if it affects local wildlife negatively in the short term? From Aaron Thomas.
Yeah, so I think this is a really great question, great issue, difficult to work your way through, and it all depends, right? It depends on the goals, depends on the habitat value that's already out there and what the improvement is going to be. This is pretty far beyond my expertise per se. Courtney or Cara, do you have any insight into this?
I was just going to comment that I've seen eucalyptus, like it was in Puente Hills, and they did a huge eucalyptus removal and kind of restoration in this area, and they got rid of this huge eucalyptus windrow, and it ended up restoring the site back to the habitat that was once there. And so for that site, it ended up working out really well. And they have gnat catchers over there, so it ended up creating more gnat catcher habitat. So it was really positive for them. I wasn't there during the process, so I don't know how they got it done, but it worked out really well over there.
Yeah, and I think often this gets a little bit into the native, non-native fight, and I'm happy to get into that a little bit if we need to. But I'll just say generally that anybody who says that eucalyptus has zero habitat value and things like that are clearly that's not true, right? If we see plenty of raptor nests in eucalyptus, we see plenty of other species using it, and so let's just try to be conscientious in making these decisions, and that when we start saying this has no value and this has tons of value, I don't think either of those statements are true, right? I think everything's sort of closer to that, and happy to get deeper into that at another time. Cara, maybe this is a good time to talk about Dr. Wood's research for just a second.
Sure, I will answer some of these other questions directly in the Q&A.
Great. So I met Dr. Wood a couple of years ago, actually at a conference up here in Portland. And I'm seeing really great research come out of his lab down at Cal State LA. And something that I'm really excited about, and something that I expect will affect sort of all the work that we do in the future. So a recent paper that came out starts by talking about social inequity in canopy in Southern California, in LA, and that by looking at these three photos down at the bottom, you can predict pretty well what the bird life, how diverse, how many birds you were going to have in low income, medium income, and high income neighborhoods, solely based on tree canopy, on the number of street trees that were there. That this seemed to be a really important aspect of bird diversity in the city. And that this shouldn't surprise any of us in terms of this sort of canopy distribution across our cities. Anyone who wants probably the best webinar I've seen this year and a great primer into this topic is called Integrating Environmental Justice into Urban Forest Master Plans. Great job by Ann Fechner and Christine Carmichael in putting this together and sort of bringing this issue to the forefront. But that this is a graphic that I really love that they showed, and want to dive into it just a little bit to highlight some of the things that they saw in our urban forest and how birds are using it in LA. the first thing that they noted was that LA is more about sort of wintering habitat than about breeding habitat, right? So there's more species and more sort of importance weighted towards these, towards what is the insect life down there during the winter and things like that. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But the thing that most people are going to notice and highlight from this paper, I think, is that there aren't very many native trees in the as street trees in the urban forest in LA, and a lot of non-native trees. And if you look at the number of birds found in those trees, that it's about twice as good of habitat in native trees compared to non-native trees, right? You're about twice as likely to find bird species in a native tree compared to a non-native tree. And so I think a lot of people, that's the takeaway that they're going to have from this. But what I really noticed, and what I think is so interesting, is looking at this in the non-native tree section. So should we be planting more native trees in LA and many other cities? Yes, absolutely. But should we also be thinking about how our non-native trees are used by wildlife, and which tree species might bring in different types of wildlife in other ways? Absolutely as well. So I would have never predicted a huge difference between southern magnolia and Chinese elm, where if you look at these two tree species, that Chinese elm seems to be about 10 times better wildlife habitat compared to southern magnolia. And so I think that this really highlights some pretty interesting things, and I'm very excited about the future of his research and other things that we might see coming from that lab. And that he's actively looking for partners, especially cities who are interested in sort of looking more at their urban forest, sharing foliage that's being removed from trees and the sort of insect loads that are on that, because those are very important to the wildlife that depend on it. So if anyone's interested in sort of exploring these partnerships of doing more research about their urban forests related both to trees and birds and the interaction in between, happy to introduce you and try to kick that off. So anyways, I'm just very excited about that research and wanted to make sure to give that little plug here. What else do we have, Kara?
Let's see. So there are a couple questions about the Survey 123 form and whether there will be something eventually available for California, similar to Arizona form.
Yeah, so we're figuring that out, and there's lots of moving pieces in terms of how Arizona, Nevada, Hawaii, and California fit together here. As far as I'm concerned, we can use that form today pretty effectively in California, and I think a lot of people used it effectively and showed that off. So I'd say go ahead and start. We are definitely going to provide comments, I'd say as early as next week probably, to the Arizona partners in telling them how we think it could be improved, how it could either be more flexible to be used in many areas, or different versions created for different states. I think either of those options is fine with me. Kara, I assume you want one version for all states. Does that sound the direction you would lean?
Sure.
Kara and I have been working on these best management practices together for 4 or 5 years now, so I can just tell you what Kara is gonna answer for everything. So.
All right. Alex Javier, in doing the homework, I did not find anything after inspecting the site for about 20 to 30 minutes from all sides, which made me wonder, if no evidence of bird activity is found, what would you consider as due diligence in completing the process? Increasing the radius around the tree site based on known species in the area, coming back again during a different time of day, other additional steps, etc.?
Great question. I love this question. Let's start with you, Courtney. What would you say is the minimum amount of time you spend on a pre-work inspection for, let's say, a single tree?
That's like asking the teacher how long your paper should be. It's as long as it takes in order for the biologist to feel comfortable in saying that there is no nest in the tree. That is not so great part of it, because if for some reason you don't spend enough time, or you've got a bunch of trees to look at in a day, so it's up to the biologist to have a certain assurance in that they did their due diligence, they spent enough time, they did a physical walk around, they did you know, they observed the tree from far back, and they did, you know, like I said, they listened, they watched the tree, and then they did a physical inspection, and that they did everything they could, and that they did not find the nest. So.
Okay, great. So let's imagine that I'm a one-person arborist. I'm going to show up and climb a tree and prune it, and it's just me. So the whole time I'm there, right, while I'm setting up my ropes, while I'm doing whatever, I'm listening. And when I hear something that catches my attention, I'm going to glance up and see what's going on up there, right? So our pre-work inspection of like how much of it is dedicated to this work, how much is dedicated to like very specifically looking, versus how much am I just being aware of the wildlife around me, I think is an interesting question. And let's remember that we're going to have a lot of opportunities to make changes when we're up in the tree. So when if we spent 5 minutes on a pre-work inspection or an hour on a pre-work inspection, it doesn't make any difference, because when we're up in the, it makes a difference. But when we're up in a tree, we're then going to continue being aware. And so if we find a nest when we're up there, that's just another opportunity to back out and say, okay, I found a nest. So being sort of continuously aware throughout the project might be more important than defining how long your pre-work inspection should be. But I would probably lean towards doing them relatively quickly and trying to get the really obvious nests. But I think that there's a lot to be said for wanting to be really detailed and what is a fair level of due diligence. Kara, you must deal with this all the time. What do you tell your crews? What's your guidance to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys covered this, that it's gonna be whatever is going on at that site. You really just can't know beforehand how much time it's gonna take until you're out there. But if you only have 20 or 30 minutes and you don't feel comfortable with the results, then absolutely make some time to come back again at a different time of day, different weather, and see if that helps you feel more confident about your results of not finding anything.
And I'll share my experience with doing a pre-work inspection where I had signed up for it. I was planning on doing it before you know, the project was going to kick off. I went out there, and it was pretty close to this, you know, it was this canal, but there was water in it, and there were birds everywhere. And I just got there and I looked around for a minute, and I was like, I need to call a wildlife biologist. Like, it was pretty clear I was in over my head, like pretty quickly. And so I think that, you know, all the sort of preparation and talk about it's not going to prepare us for what we find when we're out there, and continuing to experiment with this and get better at it, I think is all that we're really asking for, and hoping that we can reach out to people with more experience. Contact me anytime. This is what I like talking about, and I'm just a phone call or email away. So. Kara, maybe it's a good time to look at some of those Cooper hawk nest questions that we got asked yesterday. What do you think?
Sure.
All right. So does someone have those questions right in front of them? I think I got them here if I pull this up. So this is a site in Sacramento. And we have so we have a Cooper's hawk nest, very well known by the community. Often our community members know what's going on with wildlife around. They're paying attention, and they've seen them. This is in like a local newspaper all over the place. So it's in a London plain. Seems to be a relatively you know, nice, well canopied neighborhood, but in a pretty urban environment. So question number one I have is, this is a raptor nest, so a wildlife biologist would be required for any pruning work that's done done on this tree any time of the year. Yes or no? What you want to answer this? You want me to answer this? How do you want to go through this?
Sorry, I was trying to answer one of the other questions.
All right, I'll answer the first one, and then I'll ask Courtney number two maybe. So incorrect. A wildlife biologist is not needed to prune this tree. A wildlife biologist would probably be a good person to involve if you needed to remove the nest, right? In California, raptor nests are protected year round, but the buffer only exists for the active nest, right? So if there's no one nesting in this, like in December, for example, we could go into this tree and we could prune dead branches, you know, that aren't going to affect the stability of the nest. And we would only need to involve a wildlife biologist if we needed to do that pruning during the nesting season while there is an active nest there, or if we needed to remove that nest. Feel free to elaborate on that, Courtney, if you want, but I'll just read the next one and you can jump on that one. The BMPs list a 300-foot radius during the breeding season. Does that mean that no routine tree work on other trees within the buffer area can happen? So no work on any trees within 300 feet of this nest, is that correct?
I would say yes, without a wildlife biologist, and maybe with, and then the answer would change to maybe if you did involve a wildlife biologist. Depending on, because it depends on the sensitivity of the bird, the environmental conditions that are existing. The buffer may or may not be reduced if you involve a wildlife biologist and they go to the site, they observe the nest and what work you want to do around the nest and if the birds are disturbed or not.
And at least an equal chance that the buffer expands, right? That the wildlife biologist says 300 feet's not enough space in this situation. It needs to be 500 feet. It needs to be something different as well. Yep. Question number 3 is basically the same question during the done on, oh, sorry. Is any buffer zone, in any buffer zone, is a wildlife biologist required before any pruning work done on the non-nesting trees? Oh, I read that wrong. That seems like the same question as the one before. So yeah, I think the only caveat I would say to that is, like I said before, inactive raptor nests do not have buffers, right? So you can work it once they've left and won't be back for 6 months. You can do whatever work you want in there that won't actually impact that nest physically. So this area is relatively close to the American and Sacramento rivers, and so we have a question about riparian habitat. Kara, pay attention to this question because I think this is relates to something that I know you deal with a lot. So how do we deal with riparian habitat, and what do you recommend for like when these yards are basically right up against a levee, or in LA up against the, you know, the LA concrete river channel, or other situations, and the habitat value of those backyards that are basically adjacent to riparian areas? How would you handle that?
Yeah, this is a tough one, since it's somebody's backyard, and so there's probably people that live there that are using the backyard, and there's a level of disturbance that's already experienced by anything in that riparian habitat, and so those species should be more tolerant with that urban setting right there. But you are potentially providing some habitat for species that could be endangered species, protected species. So I suppose it's one of those things that you'd look at on a case-by-case basis. For us at Southern California Edison, even if it's somebody's backyard, if we've called it riparian habitat, we're going to have seasonal restrictions on when they are doing work there, and limits on how much veg removal they can do without a permit, or without having a monitor present or things like that. It's not what I would recommend for folks just doing tree trimming in their backyards. Although if it's tree trimming in your backyard, then you can probably wait unless it's an emergency situation. And so why not wait and do that work when it's outside of the nesting season? And also probably better for the trees, is my understanding as well, is there are better seasons to do tree trimmings to help the trees themselves.
Yeah, that's one of those overly blanket statements, right, of pruning in fall is always better. Certainly not true, but often the case. Yeah, so for instance, the HBC office, right, the Hort Science Bartlett Consulting office is right up against a creek. And so we looked at that a little bit when we did the CNDDB stuff last week. So I've basically been calling, it's funny, these like, you know, 6-inch crepe myrtles in the front, high habitat value area, right? So not classifying it as riparian, not classifying it as low value, because it has a lot of elements of both of those, and saying, okay, well, let's do our tree care during the winter months, and I'll do a little pre-work inspection before that work happens. But like I said, I'm walking past those trees every day. I know if there's any nests in them, right? I don't have to do necessarily this really discrete survey because I'm paying attention all the time. And that I think that by paying attention more often, sort of, you know, and less formally, we could have a lot of positive impact from that as well. I think for Southern California Edison, you're using 500 feet as your buffer from water, and that would really include a lot of very urban areas, right?
300 feet, but yeah, it definitely ends up including areas that we don't necessarily need to protect. And so when we actually do the trimming, then we do some ground truthing of our mapping exercise and try to modify our restrictions based on what we see on the ground.
Yeah, I think that would be, there's a trade-off between very easy to follow of 300 feet and something that's more flexible, right? And that it's hard to interpret that flexibility, but it gives you more flexibility. So I think there's a trade-off with that. We have 2 minutes left here. Any closing thoughts, Courtney and Cara? Any burning questions that just came in?
There's one that I really wanted to get to because I think it's an important one, and this is from Jocelyn Cohen. She says, this is a really huge paradigm shift in tree care for big projects like PG and parks, etc. That seems easier and economical. And average urban gardens, this is a big shift, yes? So I thought that was kind of an important one to get to because, yeah, it's a lot easier for like big companies like Southern California Edison to try and implement some of these BMPs, and maybe not as easy for smaller entities. So I really wanted to try and get to her question.
Yeah, I think so. I've sort of always acknowledged that, I mean, pretty literally what happened was we took Southern California Edison's approach and tried to make that available to more people, right? Of taking this sort of big company approach. And that I think we can acknowledge that that's not necessarily going to work really well for everyone. And that what I've seen is, so I partner with Brian French here in the Portland area a lot. He works on a lot of wildlife habitat stuff, is that, you know, he's a one-person company. So he's doing the climbing, he's involved in the pre-work inspections, he does it all. And his ability to learn a little bit about birds and be the person in the tree who has this knowledge and has this ability to make responsible decisions up there also gives him a big edge. And that having this sort of big sort of corporate structure has its pros and cons. So I think it goes both ways. And I do think that we're asking a lot of the people making decisions up in the trees, and that trying to get some of this information to them, whether they work at a big company or a small company, they're the ones making a lot of these hard choices, and trying to get information to them is most important. Courtney, any words of wisdom before we let you get back to your bird surveys and things you're going to do this afternoon?
No.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Cara. Thank you, Western Chapter, for doing all of the administration here, and our project partners throughout the different states and tree care for birds. Special thanks to CAL FIRE and especially the Forest Service, who provided funding for this webinar series and a lot of the programs that we sort of create and work with. But mostly thank you all for joining us today. I'm really excited that we're reaching the end of these workshops. I hope it's been a good experience for everyone, and I will see anyone who wants to join me tomorrow for the last day.